In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the AC method to factor trinomials. So this is going to be for trinomials in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And a lot of people refer to it as the AC method. I've also heard it called the master product. I like AC because you're going to begin by multiplying a times c. Now, I should mention that if your A value here, if your A value is a 1, then typically it would be kind of a waste of time to use the AC method. You would be better off just doing trial and error. And I can demonstrate that at the end of the video if you need it. But this is really a method that's going to be more useful when your A value is a number other than 1. So we start by multiplying a by c. So in this first example, 8x squared plus 10x minus 3, we are multiplying 8 times negative 3, which will give us negative 24. And we want to think about all of the factors of negative 24. So what numbers multiply to give us negative 24? And I'm going to go ahead and make a big list. As you get better at this, you won't have to make an entire list. So for example, we know 1 times negative 24 will multiply to give us negative 24. So will negative 1 times positive 24. 2 times negative 12, negative 2 times positive 12, 3 times negative 8, negative 3 times positive 8, and then 4 times negative 6, and negative 4 times positive 6. So I have my full list of pairs of numbers that multiply to give me negative 24. And then I'm looking for a pair that will add to give us the b value. In this case, the b value of our expression is positive 10. So which pair adds to a positive 10? And that would be negative 2 and 12. And that is because negative 2 plus 12 will equal positive 10. So once I have my pair of numbers, then I am going to basically break up this middle term, the 10x. I'm going to rewrite it using the values of negative 2 and positive 12 as the coefficients. So negative 2 is the coefficient of x, so that's negative 2x plus 12x. Thinking about why this is allowed, if I were to add negative 2x plus 12x, you can see I indeed would get 10x. So I'm not actually changing the problem, I'm just rewriting it. So once we break apart that middle term, then we're going to bring the first term down, that's 8x squared, and the last term, the constant, which is a minus 3. Now at this point of the problem, we have 4 terms altogether. So we have basically started with a problem that had 3 terms, which was a trinomial. And now that it has 4 terms, we're going to be using the method of factoring by grouping to factor this further. So when you are factoring by grouping, we're going to group the first 2 terms together and think about the greatest common factor for the first 2 terms alone. 8x squared and a minus 2x. So between 8 and 2, our common factor is a 2, and between x squared and x, our common factor is going to be x. So my greatest common factor is 2x between the first 2 terms. Then I'm going to group the back 2, the last 2 terms, and do the same thing and think about my greatest common factor for the last 2 terms. 12x minus 3, my greatest common factor is going to be 3. So this is GCF factoring. So we are going to factor out a 2x, but we're only factoring it out from the first 2 terms. And then I'm going to factor a positive 3 from the last 2 terms. Now, if you're still a little rusty with greatest common factor factoring, then I would recommend that you go ahead and put the division. So I'm dividing both of these terms by 2x so that I can clearly see what remains once I factor out a 2x. 8x squared divided by 2x will leave me with positive 4x, and then negative 2x divided by 2x will simplify to be negative 1. We'll do the same thing when we factor out the positive 3, so I'm dividing both of my terms by 3. 12x divided by 3 leaves me with 4x, and then negative 3 divided by 3 leaves me with a negative 1. Now, at this point in the problem, we actually have two terms altogether. So if I highlight for you, my first term here is the 2x times 4x minus 1, and my second term is the 3 times 4x minus 1. And hopefully you notice that they both have a 4x minus 1 in common, which will always happen if we have done this correctly, because we're basically going to do the greatest common factor, factoring one more time. The greatest common factor is 4x minus 1, so I am going to then factor out a 4x minus 1 from each of those terms. If it helps to show that division, you're dividing by 4x minus 1. So each of these quantities get divided by 4x minus 1. So you can see that the 4x minus 1s divide out. So we're left here with a 2x. And then 4x minus 1 divides out here. So we are left with also a positive 3. So my final answer using the AC method is going to be 4x minus 1 times the quantity 2x plus 3. Of course, I'm always going to recommend that you check this to make sure we haven't made a silly mistake. And we'll check by distributing with first outside, inside, last. So first will be 4x times 2x, which is 8x squared. Outside is 4x times 3, which is 12x. Inside is negative 1 times 2x, which is a negative 2x. And last is negative 1 times 3, which will be a negative 3. And then combining like terms, we'll end up with 8x squared. 12x minus 2x is positive 10x minus 3, which is exactly what we started with back up here. And that tells us that our factoring was correct. Moving on to question B, I encourage you to pause the video, go ahead and try this method of factoring if you're comfortable doing so, and then check your work with me, or of course listen along if you need to hear the process again. 10x squared minus 9x plus 2. We'll start by multiplying a times c. So 10 times positive 2 will be 20. And then we're thinking about the factors of 20, numbers that multiply to give us positive 20. So 1 times 20, but also negative 1 times negative 20 would work. 2 times 10, or negative 2 times negative 10. 4 times 5, or negative 4 times negative 5. These are all of the numbers that multiply to give us 20, and then we are looking for a pair of numbers that will add to give us negative 9. And it looks like my last pair will work. Negative 4 plus negative 5 will add together and give us a negative 9. So we'll use those values to break up our middle term and rewrite negative 9x as negative 4x minus 5x. Again, we're not changing the problem because negative 4x minus 5x is the same as negative 9x. We'll bring down the first term, 10x squared, and the last term, positive 2. And now we have 4 terms all together, so we're going to factor by grouping. So the first 2 terms, if I group them together, we'll figure out the GCF, the greatest common factor, which will be 2x. So we'll be factoring out a 2x from the first 2 terms. And then the back 2 terms, the last 2 terms, negative 5x plus 2, we'll notice that we really don't have a greatest common factor there other than 1 and negative 1. And because the 5x here is actually a negative 5x, so we have a negative leading coefficient when we look at just those 2 terms, negative 5x plus 2, we'll go ahead and factor out negative 1 as our greatest common factor. So back to the first 2 terms, if we're factoring out a 2x, we can think about this division. So 10x squared divided by 2x will leave us with 5x, and negative 4x divided by 2x will leave us with a minus 2. And then the last 2, if we're dividing by negative 1, we're factoring out a negative 1, we'll be left with a positive 5x, and then 2 divided by negative 1 will be negative 2. Remember, we know we've done this correctly when we look at these first 2 terms Here we have two terms. We've done it correctly if these two terms have a common factor, and they do. So we have a greatest common factor of the quantity 5x minus 2, which is what I'm going to factor out. So I'm going to factor out a 5x minus 2. Again, if it helps you to go ahead and put the division here, you certainly can. So we're factoring out 5x minus 2. So you can see then we are left with 2x minus 1. So my final factored answer appears to be 5x minus 2 times the quantity 2x minus 1. Now let's check that just to be sure with first, outside, inside, last. First will be 5x times 2x, which is 10x squared. Outside is 5x times negative 1, which is minus 5x. Inside is negative 2 times 2x, which is negative 4x. And last is negative 2 times negative 1, which is positive 2. So when we add like terms, we'll end up with 10x squared minus 9x plus 2, which is exactly what we started with. So we know our factored form is correct. Okay, our last example, part C, is 2x squared minus x minus 15. So we multiply A times C. Some of the most common mistakes that I see are students that forget to take the sign that is with the constant at the end. So make sure it's a negative 15. 2 times negative 15 is negative 30. And as you get faster with this, you won't have to make an exhaustive list. Perhaps you're not going to have to list every pair of numbers. Maybe you don't have to begin with negative 1 times 30 because there's no way that's going to add to negative 1. So perhaps you're not going to even bother listing that, or 1 times negative 30 as an example. But in the beginning, if you feel like you need to, 2 times negative 15, you can list them all. There's no harm. It's just a bit time consuming. We've got 3 times negative 10, negative 3 times positive 10, 5 times negative 6, and negative 5 times positive 6 is our full list of factors with negative 30. And then we are looking for a pair of numbers that will add to give us our b value. And in this case, the b value is negative 1. So down here we have 5 and negative 6, which will work because 5 plus negative 6 will equal negative 1. So we break up our middle term. And you'll notice as you practice doing the AC method, the order here doesn't matter. So you could get this to work if you chose positive 5x minus 6x, but it would also work if you had chosen to put negative 6x first and 5x second. The order is not going to matter as long as you make sure that the 6 is the one that's negative and the 5 is positive. So I'll go with my original order. Bring down your first term, 2x squared, and your last term, minus 15. And now let's group. So the greatest common factor between the first two terms is just an x. Greatest common factor with my last two terms, again, noticing that because that 6x is actually a negative 6x, we're going to choose to factor out a negative with our greatest common factor. So we'll factor out a negative 3. So the first two terms, we're factoring out an x. The last two terms, we're factoring out a minus 3. So dividing both these terms by x, 2x squared divided by x will leave us with 2x. 5x divided by x will leave us with 5. The last two terms we're dividing by a negative 3, so don't forget that negative. Negative 6x divided by negative 3 is positive 2x. Negative 15 divided by negative 3 is positive 5. Now we have two terms all together, and they have in common a 2x plus 5. So we'll finish this off by factoring out the common factor, which is a quantity, 2x plus 5. And then what remains, remember if you're dividing each of these two terms, divide each of them by 2x plus 5. then you can see what remains will be an x minus 3. And there is my factored form. And we'll check just to make sure you're checking and also practicing your distributing skills at the same time. So 2x times x is 2x squared. Outside, 2x times negative 3 is negative 6x. Then 5 times x is 5x. 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. And sure enough, if we add like terms, negative 6x plus 5x will be a negative 1x. So we'll end up with 2x squared minus x minus 15, which is what we started with. So we know our factored form was correct. I hope that helps those of you that were needing some help with this other method of factoring. Remember that guess and check is a valid option, and you will get very efficient, very quick with guess and check if that's the method you choose, but you can also get pretty quick and be pretty efficient with the AC method if it is your preference. You just have to go with what you are most comfortable with and what makes the most sense to you.